The beginning of an unlikely dream. In the rural heart of the 1980s Deep South, 12-year-old Cassandra Cassie Jefferson sat on the worn porch steps of her family's small shack, staring out at the vast, dusty fields that surrounded her home. The wind whispered through the tall, dry grass, but to Cassie, it felt more like the breath of suffocating poverty. Born into a world marred by inequality, she had known nothing but hardship, scraping by each day alongside her mother and younger siblings. They were a black family, living in a town still deeply scarred by the ghosts of segregation, and their options were few. Cassie's family had always lived on the edge of poverty, barely keeping a roof over their heads. Her father had died when she was 5, leaving her mother, Clara, to raise 4 children alone. Clara worked multiple jobs, cleaning homes, washing clothes, anything she could do to keep the lights on and food on the table. Despite the backbreaking work, Clara always maintained a sense of dignity and taught Cassie the value of self-worth. Never let anyone tell you who you are, Clara would often remind her children as they gathered around the small kitchen table. We might be poor, but we ain't broken. We got dreams. We got purpose. Cassie listened to those words, but at 12 years old, dreams felt distant. In a town where the color of your skin dictated how far you could go in life, Cassie saw her future in dim colors. The white families lived in larger homes, owned the businesses, and ran the town. For people like her family, success seemed impossible, a distant fantasy. The only jobs available were menial, and Cassie knew too well what it was like to be stared at in disdain by those who looked down on her family. But even in such a harsh environment, Cassie harbored a secret passion. She loved to bake. It wasn't just any kind of baking. Her love was cupcakes. She could spend hours watching her mother prepare ingredients, fascinated by how simple flour and sugar could transform into something warm, soft, and sweet. When she was old enough, her mother let her bake her own small batches. The kitchen would fill with the aroma of vanilla, chocolate, and cinnamon. And for those few moments, Cassie felt like she had control over something, like she was creating a bit of magic in an otherwise bleak world. She didn't know it yet, but baking was her sanctuary. The oven was her canvas, and each cupcake was a work of art. When her mother allowed her to bake for church events or family gatherings, people would smile in delight, savoring the little creations she had poured her heart into. To Cassie, the cupcakes weren't just desserts, they were hope in physical form. But life was relentless. As Cassie grew older, she saw her mother's struggle deepen. Bills piled up, and her mother's health began to falter under the strain of working multiple jobs. By the time Cassie was 16, she had to drop out of school to help support the family. She started cleaning houses and doing odd jobs in town, often for less than fair wages. Though she did everything she could to help, Cassie never let go of her love for baking. Late at night, after a long day of cleaning homes or working in the hot fields, she would sneak into the kitchen and bake cupcakes, experimenting with different recipes, teaching herself new techniques. The kitchen was her escape, the one place where she could dream without the weight of the world pressing down on her. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Cassie sat at the table with her mother, who was rubbing her tired hands after washing a mountain of laundry for a wealthy family across town. Clara could see the fatigue in her daughter's eyes, but she also saw the flicker of something more, something Cassie had yet to admit to herself. "You got that look in your eye, Cassie," Clara said softly, watching her daughter knead dough with practiced hands. "What's that dream you've been hiding from the world?" Cassie paused, wiping her flour-covered hands on her apron. She didn't respond right away, unsure of how to put her feelings into words. How could she explain the wild, seemingly impossible dream she held inside? "Do you ever think," Cassie started, her voice hesitant, "do you ever think we could be more than this? I mean, really more?" Clara smiled, leaning back in her chair. "Baby, dreams are what keep us alive, but it's the work that makes them real." Cassie nodded. Her mother had always been a realist, but she had never discouraged her from dreaming. For a moment, they sat in silence, the hum of the refrigerator and the scent of baking cupcakes filling the air. Cassie looked down at her hands, hands that had scrubbed floors, washed clothes, picked vegetables, and baked dreams. Maybe there was something more for her, something beyond the confines of their small town and the limitations imposed by the world around them. "I want to open a bakery one day," Cassie finally confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know it sounds crazy, but I want to make cupcakes that people will come from all over to taste. I want to make something that's mine." Clara reached across the table, taking her daughter's hands in hers. "That don't sound crazy at all. If that's your dream, then don't let nobody take it from you. But you got to be ready for the fight of your life, Cassie. Ain't nothing gonna come easy, especially for us." Cassie nodded again, but this time with a sense of resolve. She knew her mother was right. Nothing in her life had ever come easy, and she didn't expect that to change. But something had shifted in her heart. The seed of a dream had been planted, and she was ready to water it with every ounce of strength she had. Over the next few years, Cassie worked tirelessly to perfect her craft. Every spare moment was spent baking, testing new recipes, learning about the science of ingredients, and experimenting with flavors that danced on the edge of creativity. Her family and friends became her taste testers, and their feedback fueled her ambition. But no matter how hard she worked, the obstacles seemed insurmountable. Without money, starting her own bakery was a distant goal. The town's wealth was controlled by a few powerful businessmen, and people like Cassie had no access to loans or investors. It didn't help that she was a young black woman in a deeply segregated society, where people like her were expected to remain in their place. But Cassie's determination was stronger than the barriers placed before her. She could learn from her mother that when the world tries to keep you down, you fight back with everything you've got. And she was ready to fight. Little did Cassie know an unexpected opportunity was about to change everything. One that would push her to the edge of her strength, but also offer her the chance to make her dream a reality. All it would take was one moment of courage, and Cassie was about to find out just how powerful her dreams and her faith could be. The first step toward a dream. Cassie woke up before dawn one sweltering summer morning, the air heavy and still as the sun began to creep over the horizon. Her body was exhausted from working long hours at the diner the day before, but her mind was restless. The dream of owning a bakery was no longer a distant fantasy. It had taken root in her heart, growing stronger every day, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. Something inside her told her that if she didn't start moving toward her dream now, she might never get another chance. She sat up in her small, cramped bedroom, the light of dawn filtering through the worn curtains. The familiar scent of coffee and cornbread drifted from the kitchen, where her mother, Clara, was already up preparing breakfast for the family. Cassie knew she couldn't wait any longer. It was time to take the first step, even if it seemed impossible. After a quick breakfast, Cassie went to the kitchen, where her mother was scrubbing dishes. She stood for a moment, watching Clara's hands move rhythmically over the soapy water, her face set in its usual expression of quiet determination. Cassie took a deep breath. "Mama," she began, her voice steady but nervous, "I think it's time for me to start moving toward my dream." Clara paused, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and turned to face her daughter. She saw the fire in Cassie's eyes, the same fire that had been growing since the day she first started baking cupcakes as a child. Clara knew that look well. It was the look of someone ready to fight for something bigger than themselves. "And how are you planning to do that, Cassie?" Clara asked, her tone neither discouraging nor overly hopeful. She knew the world they lived in was not kind to dreamers, especially not to young black women like her daughter. But she also knew that Cassie was different. She got something inside her that wouldn't be silenced. Cassie hesitated for a moment, then spoke with conviction. "I don't have the money to start a bakery, but I've been thinking. I could start small. Maybe I can bake cupcakes from home and sell them to people around town. I know it's not much, but it's a start." Clara's lips curled into a soft smile. "That's more than just a start, baby. That's you moving forward. And forward is the only direction that matters." Cassie's heart swelled with gratitude. She knew her mother believed in her, but hearing those words gave her the extra strength she needed. With renewed determination, she began planning her next move. The humble beginnings. Later that afternoon, Cassie took a walk through town, her eyes scanning the storefronts and bustling streets for any opportunity to make her mark. The town was small, and most of the businesses were owned by the same handful of white families who had been in control for generations. The thought of approaching them to sell her cupcakes felt daunting, but Cassie knew she had no other choice. If she wanted to get her business off the ground, she needed to find customers, and that meant stepping out of her comfort zone. As she walked past the local market, Cassie noticed a woman she recognized, Mrs. Evelyn Daniels, a kind-hearted white woman who owned a small grocery store on the outskirts of town. Mrs. Daniels had always treated Cassie's family with respect, even when others in town turned their noses up at them. Cassie's heart pounded as she approached the store. She wasn't sure what she was going to say, but she knew she had to try. "Afternoon, Mrs. Daniels." Cassie greeted her with a polite smile as she stepped inside the store, the cool air a relief from the heat outside. Mrs. Daniels looked up from behind the counter and returned the smile. "Well, hello there, Cassie. How are you, child?" "I'm doing fine, thank you. Actually, I was hoping I could talk to you about something," Cassie said, her voice a little shaky, but steady enough to carry the weight of her hopes. Mrs. Daniels raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's on your mind?" Taking a deep breath, Cassie launched into her pitch. "I've been baking cupcakes for years now, and I think they're pretty good. I was wondering if you'd be willing to let me sell some of them here in your store. Just a small batch to start, and if folks like them, maybe I could bring more." Mrs. Daniels was silent for a moment, considering the young woman standing before her. She had seen Cassie grow up, watch her work hard to help her family, and she knew the kind of determination that burned in Cassie's eyes. Finally, she nodded slowly. "I'll tell you what, Cassie. You bring me a batch of those cupcakes tomorrow, and we'll see what happens. If folks like them, we'll talk about selling more." Cassie's heart leaped in her chest. She hadn't expected Mrs. Daniels to say yes so easily. "Thank you, Mrs. Daniels. I won't let you down. I promise." With that small victory under her belt, Cassie hurried home, her mind racing with excitement. This was it, the first real step toward her dream. It wasn't a bakery and it wasn't a grand launch, but it was something. And that something was more than enough for her. A taste of success. That night, Cassie stayed up late, carefully crafting the best batch of cupcakes she had ever made. She used the finest ingredients she could afford: real butter, fresh eggs, and just the right amount of vanilla extract. She frosted each one with care, adding her signature swirl of cream cheese frosting on top. The kitchen smelled heavenly, and for a moment, Cassie allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to own her own bakery someday, with rows upon rows of cupcakes just like these, all waiting to be sold. The next morning, she carefully packed the cupcakes into a box and made her way back to Mrs. Daniels' store. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the box on the counter. "These are my best ones," Cassie said, her voice full of both pride and nervousness. "I hope they're good enough." Mrs. Daniels opened the box and peered inside, her eyes widening at the sight of the perfectly frosted cupcakes. "Well, aren't these something? I'll put it out right now and we'll see what folks think." For the rest of the day, Cassie waited anxiously, unable to focus on anything else. She couldn't help but wonder if anyone would buy her cupcakes. Would they like them? Would they even give them a chance? By the time she returned to the store that afternoon, her heart was racing. As soon as she walked in, Mrs. Daniels greeted her with a wide smile. "Well, Cassie, I think you've got yourself a hit," Mrs. Daniels said, motioning to the now empty tray where the cupcakes had once sat. "They sold out before noon. People were asking if there were more." Cassie could hardly believe her ears. Her cupcakes had sold out. The joy and relief that washed over her were overwhelming, but more than that, she felt something deeper: validation. All those years of baking in secret, all the late nights spent perfecting her recipes, had led to this moment. Her dream wasn't just a dream anymore. It was becoming real, one small step at a time. The struggles of growing a business. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Word of Cassie's cupcakes spread quickly, and soon Mrs. Daniels couldn't keep them on the shelves. People from all over town were coming in to buy them, and some even placed special orders for parties and events. For the first time in her life, Cassie felt like she had control over her future. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. But as her business grew, so did the challenges. Baking from her small home kitchen became increasingly difficult. She didn't have the space or the equipment to keep up with demand, and the long hours were taking a toll on her physically. She found herself staying up late into the night, her hands aching from mixing batter and frosting cupcakes, her eyes burning with exhaustion. There were other obstacles, too. Not everyone in town was supportive of her success. Some of the wealthier families who had always looked down on her began to spread rumors, questioning how a young black woman like Cassie could be running such a successful business. She faced several acts of racism and overt hostility, especially from those who didn't want to see her rise above her station. One day, as Cassie delivered a batch of cupcakes to Mrs. Daniels' store, she overheard a conversation between two customers at the counter. "Can you believe she's actually selling those cupcakes here?" One of the women whispered, her voice dripping with disdain. "I don't know why people are buying them. She's nothing but a cleaner's daughter." The words stung, but Cassie kept her head high. She had heard worse before, and she knew that success didn't come without its share of critics. But it wasn't just about proving them wrong, it was about proving to herself that she could make her dream a reality, no matter what anyone said. Little did she know the biggest challenge was yet to come, one that would test her resolve and push her to the brink of giving up. The weight of the world. Cassie stared at the small oven in her kitchen, her fingers raw from hours of kneading dough, stirring batter, and frosting endless trays of cupcakes. Every inch of her tiny home kitchen was covered in flour, sugar, and bowls waiting to be washed. The success of her cupcake business had been more than she ever dreamed, but it was becoming clear that managing everything on her own wasn't sustainable. The demand had skyrocketed in just a few months. Mrs. Daniels' grocery store was no longer the only place carrying Cassie's cupcakes. Several local businesses had started placing orders too: cafes, diners, even a few churches for their Sunday gatherings. At first, Cassie was overjoyed, grateful that her hard work was paying off. But with each new order, the weight on her shoulders grew heavier. It wasn't just the physical toll. Cassie's success had attracted attention, and not all of it was positive. The same people who had been skeptical of her abilities from the start now seemed intent on seeing her fail. Rumors swirled around town, whispers that her cupcakes were only popular because she was undercutting prices or that she wasn't even making them herself. Some said she must have had help from someone more capable behind the scenes, alluding to a white benefactor that didn't exist. It was a familiar sting, one Cassie had felt all her life, but now it was sharper than ever. Even as she worked tirelessly, balancing the demands of her business and the challenges of being a black woman in a small southern town, the world seemed to conspire against her. Cassie knew she couldn't keep this pace forever, but she didn't know where to turn. She was alone in this venture. Her mother, Clara, helped when she could, but age and years of hard labor had slowed her down. Cassie needed more than just an extra pair of hands. She needed a plan. But right now, all she could do was keep going, hoping that something would change. The breaking point, one evening after finishing yet another marathon baking session, Cassie collapsed onto the worn sofa in the corner of her small living room. She stared at the ceiling, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her chest. Her thoughts spiraled. How could she keep up with demand? How could she ever grow her business when she could barely keep up with the orders she had now? She didn't have the money to hire help, and even if she did, who would want to work for her? The sound of a soft knock on the front door interrupted her thoughts. Cassie groaned as she forced herself to her feet, her muscles aching with every movement. When she opened the door, she was surprised to find Mrs. Daniels standing on her front porch, holding a large basket filled with fresh ingredients, flour, sugar, eggs, and butter. "Mrs. Daniels, what are you doing here?" Cassie asked, blinking in surprise. Mrs. Daniels smiled warmly, her eyes filled with sympathy. "I could tell you've been struggling to keep up with the orders, child. You're working yourself into the ground. I can't stand by and watch you do it alone." Cassie's throat tightened as a wave of emotion washed over her. She wasn't used to people offering help. She had always prided herself on being able to handle things on her own, but at that moment, she realized just how badly she needed support. "I don't know what to say," Cassie stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to say anything," Mrs. Daniels replied. "Just let me help you. I brought some extra supplies to get you through the next batch of orders, and I can come by tomorrow to lend a hand in the kitchen if you need it." Cassie hesitated for a moment, her pride battling with the overwhelming relief she felt at the offer. Finally, she nodded, her voice cracking as she spoke. "Thank you. I really appreciate it." Mrs. Daniels smiled and handed her the basket. "You're not alone in this, Cassie. Don't ever think you have to do it all by yourself." As Mrs. Daniels left, Cassie stood in the doorway for a long time, holding the basket and letting the weight of her emotions settle. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe she didn't have to carry this burden on her own. Maybe there were people who believed in her, people who wanted to see her succeed. A new beginning. The next day, Mrs. Daniels arrived at Cassie's house early in the morning, ready to help. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work, mixing batter, icing cupcakes, and even helping with the cleanup. The two women worked side by side, and for the first time in a long while, Cassie felt like she could breathe. The weight on her shoulders didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. As they worked, Mrs. Daniels shared stories of her own struggles as a business owner. Though they came from different worlds, the challenges they faced weren't so different. Mrs. Daniels had started her grocery store with nothing but a small loan from a family member and a whole lot of determination. There were times where she had nearly lost the store, times where she had doubted herself and wondered if it was all worth it. But she had persevered just like Cassie was doing now. "You remind me of myself when I first started out," Mrs. Daniels said, her voice soft as she frosted a cupcake. "I was stubborn, determined, and scared out of my mind. But I didn't let the fear stop me. And neither should you." Cassie looked at Mrs. Daniels, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I guess I've just been so scared of failing that I forgot what it feels like to have someone in my corner." Mrs. Daniels smiled. "You're not failing, Cassie. You're just figuring things out one step at a time. And sometimes it's okay to ask for help." With Mrs. Daniels' support, Cassie found herself able to breathe a little easier. She wasn't working until the early hours of the morning anymore, and for the first time in months, she felt like she had some control over her life again. But even with the extra help, Cassie knew she needed more than just an extra pair of hands in the kitchen. She needed to find a way to expand her business, to turn her home kitchen into something bigger. A risk worth taking. A few weeks later, Cassie found herself standing outside the local bank, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never imagined she would be here, about to ask for a loan. The idea terrified her. What if they said no? What if she couldn't pay it back? But after weeks of agonizing over her options, Cassie knew this was the only way forward. If she wanted to grow her business, she needed money to buy better equipment and rent a proper kitchen space. She couldn't keep baking from home forever. Taking a deep breath, Cassie pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped inside. The air inside the bank was cool, and the quiet hum of conversation filled the room. Cassie felt out of place here. This was a world of suits and ties, of business deals and wealth. But she wasn't going to let that stop her. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to back down now. She approached the counter and asked to speak with a loan officer. After a few minutes of waiting, she was led to a small office where a middle-aged man with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses sat behind a desk. His nameplate read Mr. Hughes. "Good morning, Miss Johnson," he said, offering her a polite smile. "What can I do for you today?" Cassie sat down, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. "I'm here to apply for a small business loan. I run a home-based cupcake business and I need funds to expand." Mr. Hughes listened carefully as Cassie explained her situation, outlining her plans for the future and how the loan would help her grow her business. When she finished, he sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "I appreciate your ambition, Ms. Johnson," he said finally, "but small business loans, especially for home-based businesses, are very risky. Do you have any collateral to offer?" Cassie's heart sank. She didn't have much, no property, no assets beyond her equipment. But she wasn't ready to give up yet. "I don't have much," she admitted, her voice steady but firm. "But what I do have is a business that's growing. I've got more orders than I can keep up with, and people in town love my cupcakes. I just need a chance to prove that I can make this work." Mr. Hughes studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sighed and leaned forward. "I'll tell you what, Ms. Johnson, I'm willing to take a chance on you. I'll approve a small loan to get you started, but you'll need to show consistent progress within 6 months. If you can do that, we can talk about a larger loan." Cassie's heart leaped in her chest. She had done it. She had secured the loan. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough to get started. "Thank you," Cassie said, her voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down." As she walked out of the bank, the sun shining brightly on her face, Cassie felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had taken a huge risk, but it was a risk worth taking. This was from the ground up. Cassie stood on the empty plot of land she had just rented, the grass swaying in the late afternoon breeze. In her hand, she held the modest blueprint for what she hoped would become her new commercial kitchen. A small but functional space where she could bake her cupcakes without the limitations of her home kitchen. It wasn't a grand bakery yet, but it was a start. Just like every other step in her journey, it was one she was taking cautiously, but with an unwavering determination. Securing the loan had been a victory, but it also came with its own set of anxieties. Cassie had never been in debt before, and the idea of owing money to the bank loomed over her like a shadow. The terms were clear. She needed to show growth within 6 months, or she risked losing everything she had worked for. The pressure was immense, but Cassie wasn't one to back down from a challenge. She had come this far, and she would see it through, no matter what. The next step. The loan wasn't large enough to build the dream bakery she envisioned, but it was enough to lease the land, buy the equipment she needed, and hire a small construction crew to build a kitchen. Cassie spent hours poring over the design with a local contractor, making sure every inch of the space would be functional and efficient. "I need room for at least 3 ovens," Cassie explained to the contractor, a gruff man named Ray, "and a big enough workspace to frost dozens of cupcakes at a time. I'm also going to need storage space for all the ingredients." Ray nodded as he sketched her ideas onto his notepad. "It's got to be tight with your budget, but I think we can make it work." Cassie knew she was stretching every dollar to its limit, but she also knew that this kitchen was the key to growing her business. Baking from home had been manageable when she was just selling to a few local customers, but now, with orders coming in from neighboring towns and even a few larger catering requests, she needed a proper space. The construction process was slow and grueling. Every day, Cassie watched as her kitchen slowly took shape, walls going up, pipes being laid, electrical lines installed. It was a far cry from the sleek, modern bakery she dreamed of, but it was hers. And that made all the difference. As the weeks passed, Cassie found herself growing more confident. For the first time since starting her business, she wasn't constantly overwhelmed by the demands of baking, delivering, and managing her orders. The promise of a new kitchen, a space built just for her, gave her a sense of control she hadn't felt in months. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about thriving. But even as her dream inched closer to reality, new challenges arose. Confronting doubts, one evening after a long day of overseeing the construction and baking a last-minute batch of cupcakes for a church event, Cassie sat down at the kitchen table with her mother. Clara, her ever-supportive rock, had been watching Cassie with quiet pride, though lately there was a new look in her eyes, one that worried Cassie. "Mama, is something bothering you?" Cassie asked, breaking the silence between them. Clara looked up from her cup of tea, her brow furrowed. "I've just been thinking, Cassie. You're taking on so much. This new kitchen, the loan. It's a lot to handle." Cassie nodded, feeling the weight of her mother's concern. "I know it's a lot, Mama, but I have to do this. If I don't expand, I'll never be able to keep up with demand. I've got to think about the future." Clara reached across the table and took Cassie's hand, her weathered fingers warm and steady. "I know you're thinking about the future, but I just don't want to see you get in over your head. This business, it's not like anything our family's ever done before. We don't know what's out there waiting for you." Cassie swallowed hard, understanding the deeper fear in her mother's words. Clara had spent her life working as a domestic servant for wealthy families in town, cleaning their houses, raising their children, always staying in the background. She had never had the luxury of dreaming big, never had the opportunity to take risks like the one Cassie was taking now. The thought of her daughter stepping into the unknown, taking on debt and responsibility, terrified her. "I know it's a risk," Cassie admitted, her voice soft. "But if I don't take it, then what's the point? I want more for us, Mama. More than just scraping by." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, her grip on Cassie's hand tightening. "I know, baby. I just want to make sure you're ready for whatever comes." Cassie smiled, though her heart was heavy. She knew her mother's fears were valid. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, and there was no guarantee that her business would succeed. But she also knew that she couldn't let that fear hold her back. She had come too far to turn around now. A harsh reality. As the weeks turned into months, Cassie's new kitchen was finally completed. It wasn't a grand building, but it was exactly what she needed. 3 industrial ovens, a large countertop for decorating, and enough storage to keep all of her supplies organized. The day she opened the door to her new space, Cassie felt an overwhelming sense of pride. This was it, the beginning of something bigger. She started taking on larger orders almost immediately, baking for weddings, birthday parties, and even a few corporate events in the nearby city. The money was starting to come in, and for the first time in her life, Cassie felt like she was on the path to real success. But with that success came new problems. Managing the increased workload wasn't as simple as just baking more cupcakes. Cassie had to keep track of invoices, manage deliveries, and deal with the occasional angry customer who felt their order wasn't perfect. The stress of running the business began to weigh on her in ways she hadn't anticipated. There were nights when she barely slept, staying up late to finish an order only to wake up early the next morning to start the next one. Worse still, the pressure to make enough money to repay the loan hung over her like a cloud. The bank had given her 6 months to show progress, and while her business was growing, the costs were higher than she expected. The new kitchen, the supplies, the marketing she had started to invest in, it all added up quickly. One day, as she was frosting a large order of cupcakes for a local charity event, Cassie's phone rang. It was Mr. Hughes, the loan officer from the bank. "Ms. Johnson," he said, his voice professional but firm. "I wanted to check in with you about your loan. We're nearing the 6-month mark, and I'll need to see your financials to assess where we stand." Cassie's heart sank. She had known this call was coming, but hearing it made her stomach churn. She hadn't been able to save as much as she hoped, and while her business was growing, the profit margins were thin. Too thin. "I'll have everything ready for you," Cassie said, her voice steady, even though her mind was racing. After hanging up, she slumped against the counter, her head spinning. How was she going to show the kind of progress the bank expected? What if they decided she wasn't making enough money? What if they took everything away? The power of community. That evening, Cassie sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of invoices, receipts, and financial statements. Her mind was a whirlwind of numbers and doubts. She had always been good at baking, but running a business, that was something else entirely. Just as she was about to give in to the despair creeping into her chest, there was a knock at the door. When she opened it, she was surprised to see Mrs. Daniels standing there, along with several other familiar faces, customers, neighbors, even the pastor from the local church. Each of them was holding something: flour, sugar, eggs, butter. Some had boxes of supplies, others had envelopes of money. Cassie was stunned. "We heard you might need a little help," Mrs. Daniels said with a smile. "You've done so much for this community with your cupcakes. It's only right that we give a little back." Cassie's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the faces of the people who had come to support her. She had always thought of herself as alone in this struggle, but now she realized she wasn't. The community she had served with her cupcakes had become her family, and they weren't going to let her fail. Over the next few days, the outpouring of support continued. People came by with donations, offering to help with orders or simply lending an ear when Cassie needed to vent. The love and generosity of her community gave her the strength to keep going, to push through the doubt and fear. With their help, Cassie was able to meet her financial obligations and keep her business afloat. The bank was satisfied with her progress, and she was able to renegotiate the loan terms, giving her more time to grow her business without the constant pressure of repayment. A dream realized, months passed, and Cassie's cupcake business continued to thrive. She hired her first employee, a young woman named Sarah who had recently moved to town and was looking for work. With Sarah's help, Cassie built an empire. Cassie sat in her newly renovated office, a small but beautifully decorated room attached to her commercial kitchen. The faint hum of mixers and the scent of freshly baked cupcakes filled the air. As she looked out the window at the bustling kitchen staff preparing orders, a sense of disbelief washed over her. A few years ago, she was a woman baking from her cramped home kitchen, barely scraping by. Now she had a thriving business with a team of 5 employees and regular clients that extended beyond her small southern town. But despite her growth, Cassie wasn't satisfied. She had always been ambitious. And now that she had overcome the immediate financial pressures, her eyes were set on an even bigger goal, expanding her brand across the region and maybe even beyond. What had started as a humble cupcake business had the potential to become a dessert empire. The idea had been planted in her mind during a conversation with one of her regular customers, a cafe owner from a nearby city. "Cassie, your cupcakes are unlike anything I've ever tasted," the woman had said one afternoon. "Have you ever thought about distributing them to other cities? I've got friends in Atlanta who would love your product." Cassie had smiled at the compliment, but at the time, the thought of expanding her business beyond the town limits had seemed like a far-off dream. She was just trying to keep up with the local demand. But as her operations stabilized, the seed of that idea began to grow. If she could sell her cupcakes in other cities or even nationwide, the possibilities were endless. Cassie's heart raced as she imagined the potential. Her cupcakes could become a household name. But with this dream came a daunting realization. The logistics of expanding beyond a local business were complex. She would need to scale production, ensure consistent quality, and figure out distribution. And she'd need more funding. Charting a course, Cassie's first step was to research how to scale a bakery business. She spent hours reading articles, watching videos, and talking to other small business owners who had successfully expanded. She learned about supply chain management, the importance of maintaining brand consistency, and the challenges of distributing perishable goods. It was overwhelming, but Cassie approached it the same way she had every other challenge in her life, one step at a time. One evening, as she was poring over her notes, Cassie realized she needed guidance from someone with experience. She had heard of a business incubator program in Atlanta that helped entrepreneurs grow their businesses, and after doing some research, she found that it was the perfect fit for her goals. The program provided mentorship, access to investors, and resources for small businesses looking to expand. With a determined heart, Cassie applied to the program, outlining her vision for growing her cupcake business and expanding into new markets. A few weeks later, she received the news she had been waiting for. She had been accepted into the incubator. The program required her to spend several months in Atlanta, working closely with mentors and attending workshops on everything from marketing to distribution logistics. It was an exciting opportunity, but it also meant stepping away from her day-to-day operations in her hometown. Cassie knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed someone she trusted to manage the bakery while she was gone. A leap of faith, Cassie sat down with Sarah, her first employee, and explained the situation. "Sarah, I'm going to be spending some time in Atlanta for this business program," Cassie began. "It's an incredible opportunity to grow the business, but I need someone to manage things here while I'm gone. You've been with me since the beginning, and I trust you more than anyone." Sarah looked stunned. "Me? Run the bakery?" "Yes, you," Cassie replied with a smile. "You've learned the ropes, and you've proven that you can handle the pressure. I know it's a lot to ask, but I wouldn't ask if I didn't think you could do it." Sarah hesitated for a moment, clearly overwhelmed by the offer. But then her expression softened and a small smile crept onto her face. "I'll do my best, Cassie. I won't let you down." Cassie smiled, relieved. "I know you won't." Leaving her business in Sarah's capable hands, Cassie packed her bags and made the drive to Atlanta. It was the longest she had ever been away from her hometown, and she felt a pang of homesickness as she entered the bustling city. But as she walked into the incubator's office, filled with entrepreneurs from all walks of life, she felt a surge of excitement. This was her chance to take her business to the next level. The road to expansion, the incubator program, was intense, far more demanding than Cassie had anticipated. She attended workshops during the day, learning about topics like scaling production, managing finances, and negotiating with investors. In the evenings, she worked on refining her business plan and researching potential distributors. Her mentors were tough but invaluable. One of them, a seasoned entrepreneur named Donna, pushed Cassie to think bigger. "You've got a great product, Cassie," Donna said one afternoon as they sat in a conference room reviewing Cassie's financial projections. "But if you want to make this business grow, you need to be prepared for rapid scaling. That means more than just baking more cupcakes. You need to think about branding, marketing, and distribution on a much larger scale." Cassie nodded, scribbling notes furiously. Donna's advice was eye-opening. She had always thought of her business in terms of the kitchen, baking, decorating, and delivering. But now she realized that expanding meant building an infrastructure that could support a much larger operation. One of the biggest challenges was distribution. Shipping cupcakes was no easy task. They were delicate, perishable, and required special packaging to ensure they arrived fresh and intact. Cassie worked with a logistics expert from the incubator to develop a plan for shipping her cupcakes to customers in other cities. It was expensive, but if done right, it could open up a whole new market for her business. A new partnership. As Cassie's time in the incubator came to an end, she received an unexpected offer. One of the investors she had met through the program, a woman named Rachel, was interested in partnering with her to take her cupcake business to the next level. Rachel had a background in food and beverage distribution, and she saw enormous potential in Cassie's brand. "Cassie, you've built something special," Rachel said during their meeting. "I believe that with the right investment and support, we could turn your business into a national brand. I'd like to invest in your company and help you scale." Cassie was stunned. She had hoped to secure funding through the incubator, but the idea of partnering with someone as experienced as Rachel was beyond her expectations. Still, she hesitated. Accepting an investment meant giving up some control over her business, and that was a difficult decision. "I need some time to think about it," Cassie replied, her voice steady but thoughtful. Rachel nodded, understanding. "Take all the time you need, but just know that I believe in you and I believe in what you've built." The decision? Cassie spent the next few days grappling with the decision. On one hand, partnering with Rachel could be the key to achieving her dreams of expansion. But on the other hand, Cassie had always been fiercely independent. She had built her business from the ground up, and the thought of relinquishing any control was difficult to swallow. She sought advice from Donna, who had become not just a mentor, but a trusted friend. "Cassie, you've worked so hard to build this business, and you should be proud of what you've accomplished," Donna said. "But sometimes to grow, you need to take a leap of faith. Partnering with someone like Rachel could give you the resources you need to scale in ways you couldn't do on your own." Cassie nodded, her mind racing. Donna was right. If she wanted to grow her business beyond her hometown, beyond even Atlanta, she would need help. And Rachel's experience and resources could make that possible. The next day, Cassie sat down with Rachel and made her decision. "I'm ready," Cassie said, her voice calm but firm. "Let's do this." Rachel smiled, extending her hand. "Welcome to the next chapter of your business, Cassie, a growing empire." With Rachel's investment and guidance, Cassie's cupcake business began to grow at an unprecedented rate. They opened a second location in Atlanta, complete with a commercial kitchen that could handle large-scale production. Orders began pouring in from cities across the region, and soon Cassie's cupcakes were being sold in specialty stores and cafes throughout the Southeast. The business grew so quickly that Cassie found herself traveling frequently, attending meetings with distributors, overseeing new product lines, and even appearing at food festivals to showcase her brand. It was exhilarating, but it was also exhausting. Cassie had never imagined her life would become so fast-paced. But even in the midst of this whirlwind, Cassie never forgot where she came from. She made sure to stay connected to her hometown, visiting regularly and continuing to supply local businesses with her cupcakes. She also hired more staff from the community, offering jobs to people who, like her, had once struggled to find opportunity. One day, while visiting her original bakery location, Cassie stood in the kitchen and watched as her team worked seamlessly, baking tray after tray of cupcakes for an upcoming order. Sarah, now her head baker, caught her eye and smiled. "You did it," Sarah said, walking over to her. "You built something incredible." Cassie smiled. From legacy to legend. Cassie took a deep breath, the familiar scent of vanilla and chocolate filling her senses as she stood in her original kitchen. Her bakery was buzzing with activity. Ovens whirring, mixers churning, the rhythmic tap of frosting spatulas as cupcakes were meticulously decorated by her dedicated team. Sarah, now the head baker, was orchestrating the entire operation like a seasoned conductor, ensuring that every cupcake met the high standards Cassie had set from the very beginning. It had been nearly 2 years since Cassie partnered with Rachel to scale her business, and in that time, her cupcake empire had grown beyond anything she could have ever imagined. What started as a small-town bakery was now a regional sensation with distribution in cities across the Southeast. Her cupcakes were sold in upscale cafes, grocery stores, and even airport kiosks. The Cassie Johnson brand had become synonymous with gourmet, handcrafted treats that evoked feelings of comfort and home. But with success came new challenges. Cassie's once simple life had transformed into a whirlwind of travel, meetings, and expansion plans. She was constantly on the move, meeting with distributors, negotiating contracts, and attending industry events. The pace was exhilarating, but it was also taking a toll on her. As she stood in the kitchen, watching her team bring her vision to life, Cassie felt a bittersweet pang in her chest. She missed the simplicity of her early days, the quiet mornings spent baking in her home kitchen, the intimate connection she had with her customers, the satisfaction of hand-delivering each order herself. Now, everything felt so much bigger, so much more complex. The burden of success. Cassie's success had also brought its share of pressure. The partnership with Rachel had been transformative, but it also came with expectations. Investors expected returns, and that meant constant growth. Every quarter, Cassie found herself analyzing sales reports, projecting profits, and strategizing ways to increase revenue. The cupcakes that had once been a source of joy and creativity had now become numbers on a spreadsheet. One afternoon, as Cassie sat in her office reviewing financials, Rachel called with a proposition. "Cassie, we've been approached by a major national retailer," Rachel said, her voice tinged with excitement. "They want to carry your cupcakes in their stores across the country. This could be huge, bigger than anything we've done before." Cassie's heart skipped a beat. A national deal? The thought was exhilarating, but also terrifying. Expanding to a national retailer would mean ramping up production on a scale she had never attempted. It would require hiring more staff, building new kitchens, and possibly compromising on the handcrafted quality that had made her cupcakes so beloved. "I don't know, Rachel," Cassie replied, her voice uncertain. "That's a massive step. We've only just gotten comfortable with regional distribution. I'm worried about quality control, and honestly, I don't want to lose what makes my cupcakes special." Rachel paused on the other end of the line, sensing Cassie's hesitation. "I understand your concerns, but think about the opportunities this could create. National exposure could take your brand to the next level. We're talking about serious growth, Cassie. You've always wanted to make a bigger impact, and this is your chance." Cassie knew Rachel was right. A national deal could elevate her brand to new heights, but it could also dilute everything she had worked so hard to build. The last thing she wanted was for her cupcakes to become just another mass-produced product on a shelf. She had built her business on the principles of craftsmanship, authenticity, and community, and she wasn't willing to sacrifice those values for the sake of profit. A moment of reflection. That evening, Cassie drove back to her childhood home to visit her mother, Clara. The old house hadn't changed much over the years, and stepping through the front door always brought Cassie a sense of peace. Clara greeted her with a warm hug and a plate of homemade cornbread, just like she used to when Cassie was a child. As they sat together at the kitchen table, Cassie opened up about her latest dilemma. "Mama, I've been given an opportunity to take the business nationwide," Cassie said, her voice heavy with the weight of the decision. "It's everything I've ever dreamed of, but I'm not sure if it's the right move. I'm worried about losing control, about the cupcakes becoming just another product on a shelf." Clara listened intently, her wise eyes studying her daughter. "You've always followed your heart, Cassie," she said after a moment of silence. "That's what got you this far, but you don't have to be everything to everyone. Sometimes it's better to stay true to who you are, even if that means saying no to something big." Cassie nodded, feeling the truth in her mother's words. The idea of national exposure was tempting, but it didn't align with the core of her business, the heart and soul that had driven her from the start. She didn't want to be just another name on a grocery store shelf. She wanted her cupcakes to mean something, to connect with people the way they always had. "Thanks, Mama," Cassie said, her voice soft but resolute. "I think I just needed to hear that." Clara smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze Cassie's hand. "You'll figure it out, baby. You always do." The power of staying true. The next day, Cassie called Rachel and declined the national retailer's offer. It wasn't an easy decision, and she knew Rachel was disappointed, but Cassie felt a deep sense of relief. She realized that success for her wasn't about becoming the biggest brand or expanding at any cost. It was about maintaining the integrity of her product and staying true to the values that had built her business. Instead of focusing on national expansion, Cassie turned her attention back to the communities that had supported her from the beginning. She decided to invest in local initiatives, partnering with small, family-owned stores, cafes, and farmers markets. She also launched a line of seasonal and limited edition cupcakes, which allowed her to experiment with flavors and engage directly with her customers. Cassie's decision to stay small and community-focused didn't hurt her business. In fact, it strengthened it. Her customers appreciated the authenticity of her brand, and the demand for her cupcakes only grew. She became known not just for her delicious treats, but for her commitment to quality, craftsmanship, and community. Leaving a legacy as the years passed, Cassie's business continued to thrive. She opened a few more locations in the Southeast, but she remained selective about where and how she expanded. She maintained strict quality control, ensuring that every cupcake that bore her name was made with the same care and attention to detail as the one she had baked in her home kitchen all those years ago. Cassie also used her success to give back to her community in meaningful ways. She started a mentorship program for young entrepreneurs, offering guidance and support to those looking to start their own small businesses. She became a vocal advocate for supporting local businesses and sustainable practices, and she often spoke at community events about the importance of staying true to your values. One day, while visiting one of her bakeries, Cassie watched as a young girl and her mother picked out cupcakes from the display case. The girl's eyes lit up with excitement as she pointed to a chocolate cupcake with sprinkles, and her mother smiled, indulging her daughter's sweet tooth. It was a scene Cassie had witnessed countless times over the years, but it still filled her with joy. As the girl took a bite of her cupcake, her face lit with delight. Cassie couldn't help but smile, knowing that her cupcakes were more than just a product. They were a source of happiness, a way of bringing people together. That was the legacy Cassie wanted to leave behind. The next chapter, by the time Cassie was in her 40s, her business had become a regional institution. People came from all over the Southeast to visit her bakeries, and her cupcakes were a staple at weddings, parties, and events. Cassie had become a role model for aspiring entrepreneurs, not just for her business acumen, but for the way she had stayed true to her vision. But Cassie wasn't done yet. She had new dreams on the horizon, dreams that didn't involve expanding her cupcake business, but rather giving back in new and profound ways. She wanted to create a foundation that supported small businesses in underrepresented communities, offering grants and mentorship to help others achieve their dreams just as she had. As she sat down to draft the plans for her foundation, Cassie couldn't help but reflect on her journey. From the young woman baking cupcakes in her mother's kitchen to the successful entrepreneur she had become, it had been a long and often difficult road. But every challenge, every setback had shaped her into the person she was today. And as she looked toward the future, Cassie knew one thing for certain: she wasn't done making a difference. Not by a long shot.